Okay, so now we're going to study chapter 8 of Falling Upward. This chapter is called Amnesia and the Big Picture. And as you remember in the previous chapter, Rohr talks with us about how the further journey is really about self-discovery and understanding that our true identity, our true self, has been there the whole time. We've just sort of covered it up with these externals, these costumes, like titles, or tying our identity to things like our culture or our gender or community group or church. Like we're really good at adding titles to ourselves. But in the previous chapter, Richard talks about how finding our true self is that process of shedding those externals. And by shedding our externals, we begin to understand who we truly are. And Richard used that metaphor of leaving home, like leaving our nest in order to find our true home. That is our true self. And I know that there's a lot of metaphor here, and we talk about it in more detail in the previous episode. But basically, Richard is discussing like what it looks like to understand who we truly are in God. And in this chapter that we're about to get into, Richard is continuing this theme of finding our true self and the role that religion or spiritual traditions can play in helping us discover our further journey and this second half of life transformation. And so in this chapter, Richard's going to talk with us about how spiritual teachers and religion and churches can help us break free from our false self and kind of the early thoughts about who we are, and help us to find our identity in God and God in us. And we remember Jesus' words in Luke chapter 17:21, where Jesus tells us that the kingdom of God is in us. But we seem to forget that. We seem to forget that God is in us. And I think that's part of our early amnesia here that Richard's getting at. So that's a brief summary of this chapter. So now let's dig in and let's talk about some of the specifics. So Richard begins this chapter by saying that, quote, "As many others have said in different ways, we all seem to suffer from a tragic sense of mistaken identity. Life is a matter of becoming fully and consciously who we already are, but it is a self that we largely do not know. It is as though we're all suffering from a giant case of amnesia. Period." And this continues that fairy tale theme that Richard discussed in a previous chapter about how so many stories about heroes that are built around this idea of somebody who has forgotten or doesn't know their history. They don't know that they're part of some special lineage or have some special abilities. It's almost like their identity has been hidden. And I don't know if you've ever watched or read the Jason Bourne series, but it's this idea of somebody who has forgotten who they were. And in Jason Bourne's case, he was a soldier, a very, very good soldier who did some horrible things and had undergone brainwashing ended up suffering from a major case of amnesia. And when he awakes, he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know his skill set. He doesn't know what's happened to him. And that whole series is him basically trying to overcome this amnesia, trying to understand who he really is. And what I love about that storyline is it's really a storyline of us, this storyline of like self-discovery. And when we finally realize who we are, deeply loved by God, deeply cared for, it's almost like this light switch comes on. It's like this awareness that we are in God and God is in us. And how that plays out into our calling, our mission to love and care for others just gets magnified. Richard goes on and says, quote, "It is religion's job to teach us and guide us on this discovery of our true self, but it usually makes the mistake of turning this into a worthiness contest of some sort, a private performance, or some kind of religious achievement on our part. Through belonging to the right group, practicing the right rituals, or believing the right things, these are just tugboats to get you away from the shore and into the right sea. They're just the oars to get you working and engaged with the mystery. But never confuse these instruments with your profound ability to share in the divine nature itself. Period." And I love all these metaphors of the boats and the sea and leaving the shore. Like, I love that. But sometimes, like metaphor, because it can be so deep and rich, we can miss a lot. And so this is definitely one of those passages that we should sit with and think about. And to me, here's how I'm kind of thinking about it. That religion or churches or spiritual leaders that we read in books, or even our own personal mentors who are helping us along the way, can give us great comfort, right? They can help us to see bits and pieces about the path ahead. And sometimes because the leaders have gone ahead of us, spiritually speaking, they can help us avoid errors. They can help us along that process. And this is why I think mentors are wonderful to have in our lives. They can, and churches and religion can help us to see more about ourselves. They can give us perspectives on the journey ahead and ways to deal with all of the necessary suffering and tragedies and pain that is coming our way. However, Richard also says that religion has a nasty habit of making us think that if we just do certain things, follow certain rules, practice certain traditions, or participate in special rituals, that somehow we can earn salvation. And I think we're very much like works oriented. We just want to know what's that thing, or what are those things we need to do or practice in order to earn God's love. Right? We want to know that. And Rohr isn't arguing that these religious rules or following these systems or participating in these practices, whatever they are. I mean, it could be prayer, it can be meditation, it could be studying spiritual literature. I mean, those are all beautiful things, right? And they can all be extremely helpful. But Richard's saying that those practices, those things are just tugboats. They're just tools to help us move along in the journey. But those tools, those practices, can't replace the inner work and ability to dwell in the mystery of God. Because you see, it's the Spirit of God that must draw us, and it's the Spirit of God that we must be listening to. And it was never about those works. It was always about God and understanding His love for us and that God dwells in us and that we are mysteriously in God too. It's just very interesting paradox. We are in God and God is in us. And kind of dwelling in that mystery, like meditation, prayer, reading spiritual books, talking about these things are all extremely helpful. But it can never replace the actual inner work that God does in us and that inner work of listening to the Spirit. And I think what's hard is that we all want to know, like, is there a guidebook? Is there a process? Is there a 10-step program for self-discovery, for understanding ourselves and God and understanding our true identity and connecting with that love? Like, we all want, like, that spiritual checklist. We can spend hundreds of hours in meditation, going to retreats, spending time in silence, reading spiritual books, and never get closer to God. There isn't some formula that guarantees enlightenment, some strategy that guarantees our understanding of ourselves or understanding God in a deeper way. And that is why it is so easy for us to grow frustrated and tired, and why many of us will give up in the process. Coming to terms that it's never about working harder or doing X, Y, and Z to earn enlightenment can be very frustrating. And it seems like the Richard is saying that the simple message here, the thing that we have such difficulty believing about all of this, is what the psalmist declares, and I think it's in Psalm 46, to be still and know that I am God. Like, there is so much gold in that statement about just being still and realizing who God is. Because in that process, we can begin to understand more and more of God's love and inclusive nature. And in that process, we can begin to understand who we truly are in God. And I think what's interesting is that in this process, we begin to realize that it's never been about us. Like, salvation has never been about us. Understanding who we truly are, understanding God, it's never been about us or our works. It's always been about the Spirit's work. It's always been about God's work in us. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, like, can we be more passive? Can we be more open? Can we listen more? How can we be more sensitive to the Spirit's work? What are the things we can do to just sit and listen and do nothing? And by the way, like, as I'm sharing with you these ideas, like I'm not at all claiming to be further along this journey. Like I'm just sharing with you like how Rohr is impacting me and the questions that Rohr is making me think about my own like practices and how I have to guard myself from thinking that these practices are in any way earning me the right to gain any sort of greater clarity or deeper knowledge of God. Like I'm in the same struggle. But I think like these words, these questions, and just kind of meditating on these thoughts. But I oftentimes feel this frustration. And I think my job is really to just rest in that and just be more open. Just be. And I don't know if you've ever attended a retreat or have practiced like a Christian meditation. But sometimes in those meditations, we might start off by saying that verse in the Psalms around be still and know that I am God. And you kind of just repeat that. And then you say, be still and know. And you kind of repeat that. And then you get to the point where you just say, be still. And then you say, be. And it's that moment of just reduction, breaking things down to just be, just sitting in the presence of God, no actions required, just resting. And that is probably one of the hardest things for us to do, is just to rest in God and not get caught up in the frustration of our thoughts, the practices, like just being open. And I know that this sounds so simple, but I have found it to be just difficult work. Like that inner work is very, very difficult. And I know we're using the term of inner work when we're talking about just being, but again, that paradox, like kind of that inner work begins when you do nothing and just be in God. Richard goes on and says, quote, such deep knowing about true selves is surely what John is pointing to when he says, it is not because you do not know the truth that I'm writing to you, but rather because you know it already. 1 John 2:21. We are all drawing upon a larger source, the unified field, the shared spirit. I am also relying upon your inner, deep time recognition more than any linear cognition. Period. Okay, so every now and then Rohr uses a metaphor or a phrase that causes us to pause. And when I first read the term deep time, because he says, we're all drawing upon a larger source, the unified field. I am also relying upon your inner deep time recognition. I had to pause there. I underlined it. I had never heard the term deep time recognition and wasn't sure what to make of it. And I got to tell you, like, if I didn't have Google, I would just like have a big question mark and probably never have an answer to what Richard means by deep time recognition. But thankfully we have Google. So I started to search that deep time and then Richard Rohr and trying to find out like what else did he say about deep time recognition, because I don't understand that. And I found this really helpful interview that on this podcast called On Being, where he's asked directly about what he means to live in deep time. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to that podcast or read that interview. You should definitely look it up. It's fantastic. And Richard talks about how this sort of deep time recognition, it's really a call to dwell and rest in contemplation. But I want to read to you exactly what Rohr says about this because I found it really helpful. He says, I'm sure you've been told that in the Greek, in the New Testament, there are two words for time. Chronos is chronological time, time as duration, one moment after another. And that's what most of us think about as time. But there's also another word in the Greek, kairos. And kairos was deep time. It was when you have those moments where you say, my God, this is it. I get it. Or, this is as perfect as it can be. Or, this moment is summing up the last 5 years of my life. Things and moments like that where time comes to a fullness and the dots seem to connect. When we learn how to more easily go back to those kind of moments or to live in that kind of space, that's deep time. Richard goes on and says, now I think that's what the tradition means by the word contemplation. That to be a contemplative is to learn to trust deep time and to learn how to rest there and not be wrapped up in chronological time. Because what you've learned, especially at my age, is that all of it passes away. The things you're so impassioned about when you're 22 or 42 don't even mean anything anymore. And yet you get so angry about it or so invested in it. So already the Desert Fathers and Mothers discovered this word contemplation because I believe they found the word that most believers use. And it's merely a tool to help us along in the process. Period. So I found Rohr's comments here on deep time in understanding that it's really contemplation and having those moments where things begin to connect, where we have those sort of aha moments. And I'm just talking at the surface level because I don't clearly understand even what I just read there. But I guess I do understand the concept of contemplation and kind of dwelling in silence and dwelling on God and kind of living in that moment and how time can sort of stand still at times. Like I do understand that. And I think that's part of it, but I'm obviously not getting all of it. But I don't know if you've ever had any sort of experience where you've just sat there and dwelt on God or just sat in silence and how time can seem to slow down. Time doesn't move as fast, especially when you are in silence and sit there in contemplation. And if you've ever meditated, you know, when you first start out, just sitting there for 5 minutes in silence can seem like an hour. And I went on this day-long silent retreat once, and it felt like a week. Like when you have nothing to do and you're just kind of in silence, like the whole day can feel like a week or two because there's nothing for you to do but just to sit in silence. And I think part of that can be an understanding of deep time, where time kind of slows down and you're focused on contemplation and just dwelling on God. It's a very interesting way to view time. Richard goes on and says, quote, "A person who has found his or her true self has learned how to live in the big picture as a part of deep time and all of history. Life is all about practicing for heaven. We practice by choosing union freely, ahead of time and now. Heaven is a state of union, both here and later." And this is the thought that had never crossed my mind, that experiencing heaven can happen now. I've always thought of heaven as something far off, like after I die, we all go to heaven. But I never imagined that this concept of heaven can be here, and that as we practice empathy, as we practice compassion and love and all those beautiful things on ways that we can help others and love others, like that's a way for us to practice heaven here on earth. And I gotta tell you that the hard thing is that how can we be more inclusive and loving to those who we have a difficult time relating to? It's easy to love those who love us. It's easy to love those who we agree with. It's quite another thing to actually love those who despise us, to love those who don't understand us, to love those who are mean to us. That's much, much different, and that's much, much harder. And I think about Jesus turning the other cheek and just his deep love for everyone. Like that's the hard part. That's the hard part of practicing heaven, is practicing it on those who we don't necessarily get along with, or those that we don't quite understand, especially those who are very exclusive, maybe those who are filled with bitterness and anger. Like those are the ones that need love the most. Those are the ones that need compassion the most. Those are the ones that I think we have a duty to try to just love on them and care for them and show them bits and pieces of heaven and what the gospel looks like. But it's certainly hard. It's much, much easier to stay in our own community, to stay with those who love us back. Like that's the easy part. The hard part is giving heaven and practicing for heaven by loving those who are our enemies. Like Jesus says, love your enemies. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the hard part. Richard goes on and says, quote, "The more you exclude, the more hellish and lonely your existence always is. How could anyone enjoy the perfect happiness of any heaven if she knew that her loved ones were not there, or were being tortured for all of eternity? It would be impossible, period." And it's really sad that the church, that is supposed to be loving, that is supposed to be like Christ, that is supposed to be inclusive, is so quick to cancel out anybody who doesn't believe or do the same things as us. And so I think it's right that Rohr criticizes this idea that how can we even enjoy a heaven knowing that our loved ones aren't there, and they're not there because they didn't believe the right thing that we do. They're not exactly in line with our church's thinking on salvation. we forget about God's grace. We forget about his love. We forget that he's chosen and loves even us. In all of our brokenness, God loves us. And if we can sit there and think about that, like what makes us think that he doesn't love everybody else? And he isn't working in everybody else's hearts as well. Richard says, quote, "If you accept a punitive notion of God who punishes or even eternally tortures those who do not love him, then you have an absurd universe where most people on this earth end up being more loving than God. God excludes no one from union, but must allow us to exclude ourselves in order for us to maintain our freedom. And one word for that exclusion is hell, period." So to me, I don't know if hell's ever bothered you, but it certainly bothered me, and it's been a struggle. Because the idea of God torturing anyone for all of eternity is terribly disturbing to me. And it makes God out to be more cruel than even humans. I mean, if we could never imagine torturing somebody for all of eternity for hurting us, then why would we think God would do that? Besides, if God is love, how could he torture anyone forever? And in many ways, we have been raised, especially for those who are raised in more conservative Christian circles, we've been raised with this bloodthirsty view of God. And I think about that famous sermon by Jonathan Edwards that I remember studying in high school history class. Sinners in the hands of an angry God, where Jonathan Edwards gives these metaphors of people struggling on these like spider webs hovering over the flames of hell. What a scary, scary notion. And if that's our view of God, like no wonder so many people don't want to have anything to do with that God. A God that sends most of humanity to hell for believing the wrong things. It's a scary idea. Richard goes on and says, quote, "Why would Jesus' love be so unconditional while he was in this world and suddenly become totally conditional after death? Is it the same Jesus? Or does Jesus change his policy after the resurrection? And how could Jesus ask us to bless, forgive, and heal our enemies, Matthew 5:38 through 48, unless God is doing it first and always? Jesus told us to love our enemies because he saw his Father doing it all the time. And all spirituality is merely imitation of God, Ephesians 5:1, period. So, Richard's pointing out some of the logic that we should understand. That if Christ is our model, if Christ is who we all are trying to be like, and that Christ, while he was on this earth, showed us what inclusion and love and empathy and compassion looks like. And yet Christ asks us to love and care for our enemies. It's because that's how God is. And somehow we sometimes forget that. We forget that Christ is the model. And if Christ always was inclusive, always loved, then that's not going to change. I mean, if God is commanding us to love our enemies, then he's doing that too. Richard goes on and says, quote, even Pope John Paul II said that heaven and hell were primarily eternal states of consciousness more than geographic places of later reward and punishment. The ego clearly prefers the economy of merit, where we can divide the world into winners and losers, rather than an economy of grace, where merit or worthiness loses all meaning. Period. And it's so true. It's so true that we want to earn our way to salvation. The trouble is that as we understand more and more about God, we begin to understand that it has never been about works, that it's always been about God's love, God's inclusive nature, that He takes us as we are, that it was never about having the right actions to prove our worth to God. And sadly, believing that we have to do certain things to earn God's favor has led to legalism and exclusion by the church, and has hurt so many people in the process, and why so many people don't want to have anything to do with the church, because they've had some poor experiences. They've been in environments, religious environments, where they've felt excluded, that they've been under certain rules that weren't realistic. And it is such a sad thought to think that the church has been part of creating a hell for people. And when we look at the gospel has always been about grace. It's always been about unmerited favor. I mean, that's the definition of grace. And the more we dwell and contemplate on the love of God and the all-encompassing, transcendent nature of God's love for all of humanity, in fact, for all of creation. I mean, God loves the entire world, right? Like, the more we dwell on that, I think the more loving we can become too, especially towards our enemies. That said, the more exclusive and the more narrow our thinking, the more we want to push people out for not thinking the right things or doing the same things as us, the smaller and more sad our heaven becomes. I mean, think about that. How small is your heaven? How small have you made your heaven? And I think this is where this idea of amnesia is coming into play, that we sometimes forget that God is love, that God loves the world, that God cares for the world. And the gospel is dwelling on His eternal love, and that His love can awaken us and will awaken us and remind us that this is the love we've always wanted. And if we just dwell on that, we might be able to see that His love is all around us. So I hope that I can grow deeper in this love that Rohr is talking about, and that I'll look to cultivate moments of deep time within my own soul, and look for more times of silence, look for more times of solitude, and rest in that, and not grow weary or frustrated if nothing happens, but just rest and be. I need to be still and know that He is God. Such a simple concept. But boy, do I like to muddy it up by focusing on so many external things that I can do. I'm reminded of that verse in Matthew 11, where Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart, and you will find rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." That's what it's all about. Resting in Christ. Resting in God's love. We want to busy ourselves. We want to be doing X, Y, and Z, trying to earn God's favor, trying to do the right things. And Jesus is saying, just rest. Just be. Be still and know that He is God. And I love that Jesus used that metaphor of the yoke. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. He calls all of us who are weary and burdened and have struggled and have tried so hard to follow some religious system or tried so hard to do something to feel worthy, to feel like we have earned God's love. But as we move into the second half of life and move in this journey that we're all on to understand God more, we begin to realize that, man, we have been loved and cared for this entire time. Jesus calls all of us. If you're feeling weary, broken down, hurt, Jesus is saying, I am gentle and humble. I love you. Just rest in me. It's a beautiful thought. And if we can just rest in Jesus' words there, and it's weird to think that sometimes the resting is the hardest part. We want to work so hard, but Jesus calls us to rest. Okay, so a lot of stuff in this chapter. A lot of beautiful metaphor, a lot of beautiful words and thoughts, and also some very hard things. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about the chapter called A Second Simplicity, where Richard's going to begin to talk with us about simplicity and peace that we will move into in the second half of life. And that part of this is becoming more inclusive and looking for more unity with others rather than differences. He also will discuss the role of anxiety and doubt that we can learn to accept instead of fighting all the time. And I'm particularly looking forward to discussing the section on anxiety and doubt, because those are two areas that I have struggled with and continue to struggle with. And so I'm looking forward to studying that with you, talking about it with you. So that's next time. Take care.